The most joyful letter ever written was written by a man in chains, not metaphorical chains, real ones, iron, locked to a Roman soldier's wrist 24 hours a day, in a rented room in Rome around 62 AD. The soldier changed every few hours. Paul did not. You might imagine a dungeon dripping walls, total darkness, the sound of rats. The historical record is stranger and more interesting than that. Paul was under what Rome called custodia militaris, military custody, which meant he rented his own lodging, received visitors, dictated letters, and remained permanently attached to a rotating cast of imperial guards. Josephus, writing about Roman imprisonment practices in his Antiquities, makes clear these chains were not ceremonial. Continuous, he says, day and night. So picture it. You are in a small room in Rome. Late afternoon, the city loud outside, the smell of bread and cart animals drifting through the window, a clay oil lamp on the wooden table. Paul is somewhere between 55 and 60 years old, older than most people in the ancient world lived to be. His hair is gone. His eyesight is failing. In another letter he mentions, he writes in large letters, almost apologetically, as if it embarrasses him. He is dictating to a scribe, and 3 feet away, shackled to his wrist, a Roman soldier sits doing nothing, hearing everything. That soldier heard everything Paul said. He heard Paul dictate a letter to a church in the city of Philippi, a church made up of a purple dye dealer named Lydia, who had opened her home for the first Christians in all of Europe, of a jailer and his family who turned to faith in the middle of an earthquake, of former slaves and merchants whose names Paul knew by heart. He wrote to them with a tenderness you will not find anywhere else in his letters. And in the middle of a paragraph about his imprisonment, he wrote 4 words that should not be possible from where he was sitting. Rejoice in the Lord, always, always. Not when things improve, not when you get better news always, from a man who does not know if he will survive to send the letter. That is Philippians, the most joyful document in the entire New Testament. Read it, and you will feel exactly what I mean. A joy that has no rational right to exist given where it came from. Today you are going to look at all 4 of those letters. Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon. 4 letters, 4 churches, 4 different crises, all written from one prison room. And the question underneath all of them is the one I want you to sit with. What does it mean that words about freedom, joy, and the worth of a single human soul were written by a man who was not free? But before we get there, those soldiers, the ones rotated through Paul's room every few hours, chained to his wrist, hearing every word. We will come back to what happened to them, but not yet. You need to understand who Paul was before Rome, or none of what follows will land the way it should. His name before conversion was Saul of Tarsus. Roman citizen by birth, trained Pharisee, student of Gamaliel, the most respected rabbi of his generation, a man so revered that the Talmud would later say, when Gamaliel died, the glory of the Torah ceased. Saul was his student, sharp, theologically precise, zealous in a way that frightened the people around him. And he used that zeal to hunt Christians. He dragged them from homes. He voted for their imprisonment. He stood on a hillside outside Jerusalem and watched as a young man named Stephen was stoned to death, the first Christian martyr holding the cloaks of the men throwing rocks so they could throw more freely. This is not rumor or hostile tradition. Paul admits it himself in the letter to the Galatians. He persecuted the Church of God violently, he says, and tried to destroy it. Then, on the road to Damascus, everything stopped. He falls. He cannot see. A voice and the question that will define the rest of his life. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? By the time Paul reaches that rented room in Rome, he has been beaten with rods 3 times, shipwrecked 3 times, stoned and left for dead in Lystra. Spent a night and a day adrift in the open sea. He lists these things in 2 Corinthians almost casually, as if they are simply part of the itinerary, and now chains. But here is the part most people miss. He is not bitter. Read any of the 4 prison epistles and you will not find bitterness anywhere. What you will find instead, and this is what makes Paul genuinely strange, as a human being, is joy. Structural, persistent, theologically grounded joy. The Greek word he uses in Philippians is chara. You need to hear this word correctly. Chara is not the shallow word for happiness. The Greeks had a different word for that. Chara is the kind of joy that operates underneath circumstances rather than because of them. It is active, chosen. Paul uses chara and its verb form chiro 16 times across 4 chapters. 16 times, from a prison room where he does not know if he will live to see another season. How do you explain that? The answer, I think, lives in the second letter, Ephesians. This one requires you to slow down. Because Paul is doing something unusual here. He is not writing to a church with one specific crisis. He is writing what amounts to a vision of the architecture of everything, the widest view of reality he ever attempts to put on paper. And at the center of it he places one word, mysterion. You need to hear this correctly too. A mysterion in Paul's world is not a mystery, in the detective sense, a puzzle waiting to be solved. A mysterion is a secret that has been hidden since before time, and is now, for the first time, being announced. Not a riddle, a revelation. And the secret Paul announces in Ephesians would have stunned every Jew and Gentile who heard it read aloud in that first century. Jew and Gentile people divided for 1,000 years by language, by law, by temple walls, by the accumulated weight of history, are now one body, one new humanity. Paul almost certainly has in mind the literal stone barrier in the Jerusalem temple that separated the court of the Gentiles from the inner courts. That wall carried an inscription in Greek and Latin threatening death to any foreigner who crossed it. Archaeologists have found pieces of it. That wall, Paul says, is down. He writes this from a room he cannot leave. He announces the end of the oldest division in his world from a place of maximum personal constraint. Pay attention to this. It matters more than it might seem right now. The third letter is Colossians, written at the same time as Ephesians. Carried by the same man, a trusted companion named Tychicus, to a church in a city Paul had never personally visited. The congregation was being pulled toward a teaching that ranked cosmic powers and angelic hierarchies above Christ, a kind of spiritual elitism. Paul found not merely wrong but dangerous. His response is the most concentrated statement of who Jesus is anywhere in his letters. He calls Jesus the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, the one in whom all things hold together. Think about what you are reading when you read that. The man writing those words is held together by nothing more stable than a bureaucratic delay in the Roman legal system. His situation is the opposite of certain, and he writes, all things hold together. At the very end of Colossians, Paul takes the pen from his scribe and writes one line himself. Large letters, because his eyes are failing. Remember my chains, not as guilt, not as a plea, as proof. These words cost me something real. They are not theory produced from a comfortable chair. They come from someone who paid to write them. But we have not talked about the fourth letter yet, the shortest. Barely 300 words. And some scholars call it the most dangerous thing Paul ever put on paper. Something is also happening at the end of Philippians that you absolutely need to see before we go there. If you have made it this far, you are inside one of the strangest stories in all of ancient literature, the story of a man chained in order to be silenced who became impossible to contain. If this is landing for you, subscribe and stay with this channel. What I am about to show you next is the part most people never reach, and it changes everything. Go back to Philippians. Because near the end of that letter, Paul writes what sounds like a passing greeting and is actually one of the most astonishing lines he ever put on paper. He says, "All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household." Caesar's household. Read that again slowly. The man chained to Roman soldiers. The man the empire is in the process of deciding whether to execute is writing to a small church in northern Greece and telling them that Christians have appeared inside the palace complex of Emperor Nero. Servants, freedmen, administrators' people, embedded at the very center of imperial power, have heard what Paul was preaching from his prison room. How? Paul spent 2 years in that room. Soldier after soldier rotated through, chained to his wrist, sitting 3 feet away while he dictated prayers and arguments and sentences about a risen Jewish carpenter who he believed had defeated death itself. Some of those soldiers went home after their shifts and told people. Some of them believed. The chain that was meant to silence. Paul became the chain that delivered his words directly into Caesar's house. Here is what most people miss about Roman military custody. A soldier assigned to guard duty could not refuse. He could not request reassignment because the prisoner was too theologically stimulating. He was locked in, literally. And Paul, who had once been the Roman Empire's most effective instrument against early Christianity, was now building a church inside the Roman military one guard. At a time, he calls himself in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, an ambassador in chains. An ambassador, not a prisoner, not a victim, an official representative of another kingdom, temporarily inconvenienced by the logistics of this one. Hold that thought. Now Philemon. The 4th letter, 335 words in the original Greek, the shortest document in the New Testament. And I want you to understand what Paul is actually doing here, because on the surface it reads as a polite personal note, and it is not polite in the way you might assume. Onesimus was a slave. He belonged to a man named Philemon, a wealthy householder in the city of Colossus, a leader in the local church. A man Paul calls his dear friend and fellow worker. Onesimus had run away. Under Roman law, this was a serious matter. A runaway slave who was caught could be beaten, branded, or executed at the owner's discretion. The master had total authority. No appeal, no process, no exception. Onesimus ran from Colossus and ended up in Rome, in the same city as Paul, found him somehow in that crowded capital of hundreds of thousands of people, and according to the letter, came to faith in that prison room. Paul calls him his son. Born in my chains, he says. And Paul immediately faced a decision. He could keep Onesimus with him. He says exactly this, that Onesimus has been useful. There is a wordplay in the Greek that you would have caught immediately if you were in that 1st century audience. Onesimus literally means useful. You were Onesimus by name. Paul is saying, now you are Onesimus by nature. But he sends him back with a letter, and what Paul does in that letter is worth slowing down for. He does not quote Mosaic law on slavery. He does not launch a formal theological argument against the institution. He does something more precise and, in the Roman world, far more radical. He calls Onesimus a dear brother. He asks Philemon to receive him not as a slave, but as more than a slave, as Philemon would receive Paul himself, and then, with a calm precision that sounds like courtesy and operates like a vice. Paul writes, I say nothing about your owing me even your own self. That sentence is doing enormous work. Paul led Philemon to faith. Philemon's entire spiritual life is a debt owed to Paul, and Paul is applying that debt, asking Philemon to pay it by canceling the legal consequences for a man who, in Rome's eyes, is property, in a society built on the absolute legal authority of a master over what he owns. This letter is not a gentle request. It is a hand grenade delivered in the tone of a dinner invitation. Philemon cannot say no without saying something catastrophic about what he actually believes about the gospel of the gospel. He has organized his life around, if this is landing for you, stay with me. What comes next is the reason I made this video. There is something Paul writes in Philippians that most readers walk past without stopping to feel its weight. He says, I do not know which I shall choose. To depart, the Greek word is analuo, a nautical term for loosening the ropes of a ship from the dock, casting off, or to remain. He is describing death as a departure, as casting off from one harbor and setting sail for another. And then he says, what should stop you cold? It is far better to depart, far better. He believes death is the superior option. But then, and this is the sentence, I want you to carry with you, he says. I will remain for your sake, because you still need me. Sit with that, a man who believes death is better, choosing to stay alive for other people. Not from fear, not from instinct, from the same chara that runs through every page he has written from that room. Now I need to bring someone else into this story. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German pastor, theologian, author of The Cost of Discipleship. He was arrested by the Gestapo in April 1943 and held at Tegel prison in Berlin. He knew almost certainly that he would not survive, and from that cell separated from his family, from his fiancée Maria von Wedmeyer, from his closest friend Eberhard Bethe, he wrote letters. Those letters were published after the war as letters and papers from prison. When you sit down with those letters and Paul's prison epistles side by side, something happens that is difficult to describe. The voice is the same. Not the style Bonhoeffer writes in German in a different century, with different vocabulary, but the temperature is the same. The same clear-eyed realism about his situation and absolute refusal to despair. The same quiet decision to keep thinking, keep writing, keep speaking right up until the moment you cannot. It is not because Bonhoeffer was imitating Paul, though he knew Paul's letters deeply. It is because the same conditions produce the same clarity. When you strip away every plan you had, when you remove every option and every exit, when the chain is on your wrist and the hours stretch long, and the outcome is no longer in your hands, you find out what you actually believe. Bonhoeffer writes from Tegel, I believe that God can and will bring good out of evil, even out of the greatest evil. He writes this while the Gestapo is deciding his fate. He is executed on April 9, 1945. 23 days before the end of the war. Paul is executed in Rome around 67 AD. Eusebius records it in his church history. Beheaded because Paul was a Roman citizen, and even a Rome that killed its own followed its rules about how. 2 men, 2 cells, 2,000 years apart, both choosing to stay present, to keep writing, to keep speaking right until the moment the choice was taken from them. And now the soldiers. Paul writes near the end of Philippians that his imprisonment has become known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was the elite unit that rotated soldiers through prisoner custody. Over 2 years, Paul had been chained to hundreds of them. And the message he preached, he says, explicitly had spread through all of them. These are the men connected to the Palatine Hill, to Caesar's household. They go home after their shifts. They eat dinner, they talk, and slowly, impossibly, the words of a chained Jewish preacher from Tarsus move through the bloodstream of the most powerful military institution in the ancient world. Rome tried to silence Paul by chaining him to its own soldiers. It did not work. Go back one final time to the last line of Colossians, the one Paul writes himself in his own hand. Remember my chains. He is not asking you to pity him. He is asking you to remember that these words were not free, that the joy in Philippians cost something real, that the vision of one new humanity in Ephesians was announced by someone who gave up everything to believe it, that the courage of Philemon handing a theological hand grenade to a man he loved came from someone who had nothing left to protect. The chain was not the obstacle. It was the proof. 3 things. First, the truth about these 4 letters. They were not written from strength. They were not written from safety or a quiet study. They were written from a place of radical constraint. And you cannot separate that constraint from what the letters say, because the constraint is the point. The joy in Philippians is not possible without the chains. The vision of one new humanity in Ephesians is not convincing unless someone is paying for it. The courage of Philemon is not radical unless Paul himself has nothing left to lose. If you lift these words out of that prison room, you lose exactly what makes them matter. Second, what this means for you, right now, wherever you are sitting as you watch this. You do not have to be free to speak truth. You do not have to be safe to love someone well. You do not have to have your situation resolved before you decide what you actually believe. Paul wrote from prison. Bonhoeffer wrote from prison. The most durable words you will ever read were not produced by people in easy circumstances. They were written by people who had been stripped down to what could not be stripped away and found, to their own surprise, that it was enough. Third, and I want you to feel this one. Paul knew he might die, he said so. Without drama, he wrote Philemon, not knowing if it would be the last thing he ever sent. He dictated Ephesians, not knowing if anyone would read it 100 years later, let alone 2000. But he wrote every word as if they would, as if someone, somewhere, sitting in their own kind of prison, whatever that looks like for you today, would one day read them and find out they were not alone. You are reading them right now. 2000 years later. He was right. Which of the 4 prison epistles hit you hardest, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, or Philemon? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.